Automation equals orchestration, correct? Surely they're the same thing. All the service provider needs to do is buy an orchestration solution, plug it in, and the network is transformed. Well, actually, no, it's not that simple. Time to debunk some network orchestration myths with Andrew Coward, CEO of Lumina Networks. Andrew, good to see you again.
You too.
Now, you've been getting a little perturbed recently. What's been causing this fixation?
Yeah, well, we've been in the automation business for about 6 years now, and we see a lot of projects that have really failed, not just once, but multiple times. And there's a number of reasons for that. The first is that they tend to get wound up into a particular vendor, and frankly, they've been missold by a lot of the kind of orchestration vendors that are out there, that just taking this one orchestration tool can solve everything that's in the network, and that's just not the reality. I think the other problem that we find is that a lot of these automation projects start out just by touching one thing. They want to go solve one problem. Be it top of rack data center automation, help desk ticketing automation, provisioning of an optical domain, and they don't think about all the other things that will later need to be automated. So what happens is you end up with these little islands of automation where one piece of the task runs really, really quickly, and then you're onto a manual process for the next piece. And none of these automation parts really tie together. So that's a kind of massive issues, if you like. And a kind of overarching between these things is essentially that there's no strategy that's been laid out around how automation is supposed to take place across the company. And so if one group does one thing, without kind of reading the document, if you like, on what they're supposed to do together, then again, you get this separation. And that, again, requires unstitching and reworking to get to the end destination here, which is complete kind of closed loop automation from end to end across the entire domains of the network, optical IP, the data center, the CPU devices, overlays, and so on. That's really what you have to do if you're going to put an automation strategy together.
So why are so many of these automation projects currently failing?
Yeah, well, I think to start with, a lot of them are started on the assumption of just trying to solve one problem, like automating a top of rack switch, or creating help desk tickets automatically, or doing an optical domain provisioning action. And so these things tend not to think of things holistically in terms of all the elements of the network that need to be automated. So that's definitely one challenge. I think they're frankly missold products by a lot of vendors. And kind of linked to all those, there's no overarching automation strategy that's been written down or conveyed, so that once you've done one task, you can move on to another and know that they all link together in a chain. And so what tends to happen is we have these islands of automation that are taking place where you haven't really achieved this kind of end-to-end automation goal that you might have set out to achieve. And so then you have to back out of some of these proprietary solutions and kind of start again. And that's really painful, as you can imagine.
I mean, this is a very serious problem, and you've got your service providers trying to ratchet up their innovation, trying to get out services faster, more agile services. You've done some work here, and you've identified 3 common myths. So let's take them one at a time. And the first thing you say is, myth 1, it is easy to deploy orchestration without SDN.
Yeah, well, you can't. I mean, you can deploy orchestration, and so I use the analogy. You can drive from San Francisco to New York, right? It's going to take you 3 or 4 days. You're going to be really tired. And when you've got there, you've got to drive all the way back. So deploying orchestration without SDN is kind of similar, because essentially everything that the orchestrator is now going to do in the network has basically got to be done manually and got to be done repeatedly with every product, with every item, with everything that goes into the network. So orchestration without abstraction is really the challenge here. But let's not forget, why is SDN important? It's kind of a fundamental question in this. Well, SDN is this abstraction layer in the network that's designed to separate the business logic of orchestration from the device logic. And so it shouldn't matter what type of switch or router or optical device or radio access network you have from the vendor. Your business logic should stay the same. And so what tends to happen is these orchestration vendors are locking in into specific products, or they're hard coding essentially their business logic to a particular device. And that's really dangerous, because whenever a device is upgraded or changed, then the business logic has to change. And so you kind of get this perverse result, which is that automation is actually slowing down deployment and not accelerating it because of all these kind of challenges. Again, because you've decided to drive from San Francisco to New York instead of fly. And again, the orchestration vendors, frankly, have a lot to answer to here, because they're coming in with we can solve all of this, we can do all of this, and we've seen projects that are 2-3 years in, and they still don't have some simple automation tasks done. And that's a tragedy, and fundamentally for the telco, who were expecting to get what can be hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars of savings out of their network, these are way off track.
What about the next myth then? Network overlays, the fact that overlays simplify automation. Well,
overlays are really important in the kind of modern world of networking. They're important in the data center for connecting to compute and kind of stringing together elements in the data center. They're also important in technologies like SD-WAN, where we're choosing which path to take across the network and so on. But overlays, just by their nature, obviously don't understand anything that sits underneath the network. I mean, they don't understand switches, they don't understand optical networks. All they assume is that all of these things are already there and already work. And so all they're doing is essentially connecting, things that sit on top of that. And that's wonderful if everything underneath works. But essentially what happens when you deploy an overlay is that it becomes another thing to manage. So now you've got another domain that now needs to be automated and controlled. So it's not a panacea. Now, it works really well if you're a cloud provider, for example, and you're running an overlay on top of somebody else's network, because it's not your job to manage that network or provision that underlay. But if you're a carrier, then you have to do all of those tasks. So what you want is a convergent strategy, not a divergent strategy. And overlays are, by their nature, a divergent strategy because you've got yet more things to manage. So they have to be thought about in the context of everything else that goes on in provisioning and managing the entire network.
So let's look at the third and final myth then, Andrew. And that is that workflow tools make network upgrades easy.
Well, workflow tools are a really important part of the automation strategy. But they tend to get used, really, if I can say the word, kind of to hack things together, certainly on a task-oriented basis. So meaning you've got one job that you need to get done, you write some scripts, use a workflow engine to do it. And the great thing with workflow engines is that they can take input from the network and make decisions on them. So if this happens, then do this. So for example, if a link fails, then take these actions. So a really important part of the overarching automation strategies. But if those scripts, if the workflow is tied directly to the device, then you get problems later on. So initially, everything looks great, and until you come to do an upgrade, a minor software upgrade of a device, or a change of device, or a change of vendor, and suddenly all those scripts have to be rewritten and retested and reintegrated. And the reason that is taking place is because, again, the workflow is being directly hard-coded to the underlying devices and hasn't gone through abstraction, hasn't gone through SDN, essentially. And so without that, you've got this kind of massive issue of the more scripting you do, the more workflow that you do, then the harder it becomes to upgrade the network and make changes essentially over time. So you've got this kind of paradox that the workflow engines are actually slowing you down and not accelerating the automation plan.
So with the importance on SDN and abstraction, doesn't this limit the choices available for service providers?
No, on the contrary. Part of the strategy that should be playing out here is the use of open source. So yeah, it's possible to take an SDN solution and get locked in to a particular vendor. But one of the beautiful things about using open source here, particularly in the SDN domain, is that by its very nature, it's working with all of the different vendors. And in fact, particularly with the project we use, Open Daylight, as an example, most vendors now have been compelled to support Open Daylight and provide the integration and so on. So when they show up in a network, when the vendor shows up in a network, their products, if they're current, are designed to work with Open Daylight out of the box. And that's a fundamental. And not only that, many vendors require that they continue to support them through the life, to support Open Daylight through the life of that product. And so what you then end up with is this very open, unrestricted ecosystem where open source is taking a really kind of center stage role in the middle of the network as this abstracted domain, kind of neutral territory, if you like, to play this important role of separating the business logic from the device logic. And that's exactly what's playing out in a lot of these networks now.
So what do we conclude from this? What is the advice that you would give to those service providers?
Well, I think that the advice is kind of follow the plan. I mean, this is very clearly laid out in an architectural sense from Etsy, from groups like TIP, and from Cord and so on. SDN, an abstraction of the network, is a really important element in this. And if you kind of cheat, if you like, and directly code all your automation to the devices and don't put abstraction in, don't put SDN in, then you will have these challenges. And as I was seeing that in spades. And so for any automation task, fundamentally, there needs to be a plan, and the plan extends beyond just the thing you're trying to automate. The end destination that everybody's trying to get to is closed loop automation, meaning that the network is making decisions about what's going on at a device level, at a function level, and feeding those back into the network to fix problems, to provide analytics, to provide help desk tickets, to enable customers to self-manage their network. All of these things feed into that. And without a coherent and end-to-end strategy, then, as we've seen, bad things happen.
So no shortcuts, follow the rules, follow what's out there. What has been prescribed is accurate. It's up to the industry to adhere to those guidelines and recommendations.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to all the architectures that have been laid out, it's very clear when those are implemented, and we've seen those in telcos like AT&T, for example. Then they absolutely get the savings and impact on the network. The CFO of AT&T has been on the record of saying that they're saving over $1 billion from going through this automation plan, having executed it against plan, with a coherent strategy from the beginning. And we've seen that at other telcos too, and obviously. But as I say, when we come in, we often find that's not been the case, and there's a lot of resets to do. So this is a plea, really, to make sure that you've got these kind of end-to-end strategies as you start out.
Andrew, great advice. Let's hope more service providers listen. And for the moment, thanks for talking with us again. Always a pleasure. Andrew Cowd, thank you very much.
Thanks, Guy.